The Pennsylvania Railroad, or sometimes just called the Pennsy, was an American Class I railroad and one of the most famous railroads in American history. For a long time, they were easily one of the most successful. Over the course of their existence, they acquired, merged with, or owned part of at least 800 other rail lines and companies. By the end of 1926, they operated over 11,000 miles of rail line. And during that same time, they carried nearly 3 times the traffic as other railroads of comparable size, like Union Pacific or Santa Fe. Their only real rival was New York Central, but even they only carried around 3/4 of Pensy's ton miles. Their overall success was a mix of clever routing as well as very conservative business practices, never willing to necessarily overspend or take major risks. It worked out well for them for a long time, though in the end, it would also be their downfall. The initial concept for the Pennsylvania Railroad can be traced back all the way to 1825, with the opening of the Erie Canal, as well as the beginnings of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in 1828. A major hub of business, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was rather concerned that Philadelphia's port would lose traffic as a result of these canals. Which, to be fair, was a valid worry. After all, the canals were there to divert ship traffic around ports. Why send it over land when you can now send it through the canal? And Pennsylvania's state legislature was pressed to actually build a canal across Pennsylvania, thus resulting in the main line of public works, which was commissioned in 1826. Now, if it wasn't already obvious, it became quite clear to them that building a canal across the state was a ridiculous idea. So instead they started looking at possible alternatives, including new technology, the railroad. But at the time, it was intermixed with inclined planes as well as smaller canals. The route would consist of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, canals dug up the Susquehanna and Juniata rivers, as well as an inclined plane railroad called the Allegheny Portage Railroad. They'd also have a tunnel across the Allegheny Mountains and canals down the Conemaugh and Allegheny rivers into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on the Ohio River. This project was actually completed in 1834, but it wasn't really a solution. See, freight and passengers had to constantly change, vehicles the whole way. It wasn't just one shot. You had to jump from a train to a canal, to a train, to another canal. It was just a pain. In 1846, 2 applications were sent to the Pennsylvania legislature. The first was for a new railroad, called the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, to build a line between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. The second was actually the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which wanted to build a line from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, Maryland. The legislature would ultimately grant both applications, but with conditions. If the Pennsylvania Railroad did not raise enough capital and contract to build enough of a railroad within a year, then the B&O bill would become effective, and the Pensy's void, thereby allowing B&O to build into Pennsylvania and on to Pittsburgh. Basically, the new Pennsylvania Railroad Company was on a time crunch. They had to make significant progress within a year, otherwise their immediate rival B&O would take over. But they did pull it off. The Pennsylvania Railroad fulfilled the requirements, and the letters patent were issued by the Pennsylvania governor on February 25th, 1847. The governor also declared B&O's rights void the following August. That same year, the Pensy's directors would choose J. Edgar Thompson, who was an engineer from the Georgia Railroad, to survey and construct the new line. He wound up choosing a route that followed the west bank of the Susquehanna River northward to the confluence with the Juniata River, then follow its banks until the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains were reached, at a point that would eventually become Altoona, Pennsylvania. Traversing the mountains would be obnoxious, so the line would climb a moderate grade for 10 miles, until it reached a split of 2 mountain ravines, which would then be crossed by building a fill and having the tracks ascend a 220-degree curve known as Horseshoe Curve that limited the grade to less than 2%, totally within the limits that locomotives could handle. The crest of the mountain would eventually be passed through by constructing the Galitzin tunnels, and after which the route would descend a moderate grade into Johnstown. The Pennsy opted to build the line from both directions, So the western end came from Pittsburgh, heading east along the Allegheny and Conemaugh rivers into Johnstown, while the eastern end was built from Harrisburg to Altoona. In 1848, the Pennsy contracted with the Harrisburg, Portsmouth, Mountain Joy, and Lancaster Railroad to buy and use equipment over both their lines, and thereby provide service from Harrisburg east to Lancaster. In 1851, tracks were completed between Pittsburgh and Johnstown. In 1852, a continuous railroad line ran between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh over the tracks of several different entities, including the Pennsy. Then in 1853, the Pennsy was granted trackage rights over the Philadelphia and Columbia, which provided a connection between those two cities. By 1854, the Pennsy completed its line from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, which eliminated the need for the inclined planes of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. In 1857, the Pennsy purchased the main line of public works from the state of Pennsylvania. That particular purchase included 275 miles of canal, as well as the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad and the new Portage Railroad, which had replaced the Allegheny Portage Railroad. The Pennsy would actually abandon most of the new Portage Railroad in 1857, as it was redundant, and in 1861 the Pennsy leased the Harrisburg, Portsmouth, Mountain Joy, and Lancaster Railroad, which brought the entire stretch of line between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia under their control. The Johnstown to Pittsburgh stretch of canal was actually abandoned in 1865, and the rest of the canals were sold to the Pennsylvania Canal Company in 1866. The Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to stick to what they were, named for, the railroad. The canals had been a solution for their time, but they were slow and cumbersome, and they knew the future laid in the rails. Their main line was actually double-tracked from its inception, and by the end of the century, a third and fourth track were added. Over the next 50 years, the Pennsy expanded by gaining control over other railroads through stock purchases and 999-year leases. They were so successful that after their first year of operations, they paid a dividend and continued it without interruption until 1946. Part of the reason for the Pensy's success was not just due to their conservative and relaxed business approach, or their ability to eye up other railroads to expand to, but also their location. Location. The area between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, as well as pushing north towards New York and down to Baltimore, is an economic hotbed. It still is. Goods and people need to move through that area rapidly, all the time. And the Pennsy wound up in a solid position to make absolutely certain that they were the best choice for moving everyone and all their stuff. Their charter was supplemented on March 23, 1853, to allow them to purchase stock and guarantee bonds of railroads in other states, up to a percentage of its capital stock. Lines were then aided by the Pennsy in hopes of securing additional traffic from them. By the end of 1854, Pennsy would purchase stock in the Ohio and Pennsylvania, the Ohio and Indiana, the Marietta and Cincinnati, the Maysville and Big Sandy, and the Springfield, Mount Vernon, and Pittsburgh railroads, which totaled about $1,450,000, which is nearly $50 million in today's money, which sounds like a lot, and it is, but Pennsy had the money. The Steubenville in Indiana was assisted by the Pennsy in the form of a guarantee of $500,000 worth of bonds. In 1856, a controlling interest was then purchased in the Cumberland Valley Railroad, and the Pennsy constructed additional lines in Philadelphia. In 1857, the aforementioned main line of public works was purchased for $7,500,000. That's a little less than $250 million in today's money. But again, they had it. The company was an astonishing, rocketing success, and would continue to be so for many, many years. The Pennsy generally coasted on their economic powerhouse of an area, expanding where they could, but economic ups and downs beyond their control would of course limit what they could do. And like I said, they were always very conservative, never wanted to be too bold with their decisions, but also never impractical. This methodology can be seen as a bad idea, but in the situation they were in, again, economic hub of the United States, it was fine for them. Why take unnecessary risks when you're already doing so well? But it wasn't like they didn't try to innovate. Their locomotives became legendary in many regards, and they did attempt electrification. In the early 20th century, they tried to start using electric locomotives, and their first effort would be in the New York terminal area, where tunnels and city law had restricted the burning of coal, which simply meant they straight up couldn't use steam locomotives. So at the time, what else could they do? In 1910, they began operating a direct current, DC, 650-volt system, using a third rail, and it was used to enter Penn Station in New York City via the Hudson River tunnels. This showed the company that there was some cost saving to be seen from electrification. It's true, it took money to implement in the first place, but once it got going, it actually saved them money. So they then moved to electrifying the Philadelphia terminal area, and this time they used overhead lines to supply power to the suburban trains that ran out of Broad Street Station. In this instance, they did not go with DC. Instead, those wires would carry an 11,000 volts, 25 Hz alternating current system, AC. And seeing the benefits they got from doing that, it became the standard for all their future installations. On September 12, 1915, electrification of the line from Philadelphia to Paoli, Pennsylvania was completed. Many lines in and around Philadelphia began to be electrified, all the way out to Trenton, New Jersey. In 1928, the then president of the Pennsy, William Wallace Atterbury, announced plans to electrify the line between New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Harrisburg. This would be a major project, and despite the fact that the Great Depression would hit during construction, they still persisted. Pennsylvania Railroad wasn't hit as hard by the Great Depression as other companies just because of where they were. People still needed them to move stuff, and because of their conservative approach, they didn't have to worry about a lot of additional expenditures. They still had enough money to finish the project, and they knew if they did, it would save them money. In January of 1933, through mainline service began between New York and Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Paoli. The first test run of an electric train between Philadelphia and Washington occurred on January 28, 1935. On February 1st, the Congressional Limiteds, which were two different trains that ran in both directions, were the first trains to operate using electric locomotives regularly. They were pulled by the legendary GG1 locomotives. In 1934, the Pennsylvania had actually received a loan for $77 million from FDR's New Deal Public Works Administration to help complete the electrification project they had started in 1928. They still wanted to connect to Harrisburg, and work on that began on January 27th in 1937. It was done just short of a year later. The first passenger train, the Metropolitan, went into operation over the electrified line from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, and by April 15th, the electrified freight service from Harrisburg to Enola Yard was finally inaugurated, which completed their Eastern Seaboard electrification program. By the end of it, they electrified 2,677 miles of track, and that was a big deal, not just for them, but for the United States. It represented 41% of the country's electrically operated standard railroad trackage. Portions of it are still in use now, owned and operated by Amtrak as the Northeast Corridor, as well as the Keystone Corridor high-speed rail routes. Other sections are utilized by SEPTA and New Jersey Transit. Pennsylvania Railroad, almost a century ago, demonstrated the benefits of electrifying their lines. With the lines freshly electrified and World War II on the horizon, Pennsy, like most railroads, easily rode through the booming war economy of the early 1940s. It was an astonishing bit of success for them as they were in a solid position to move an incredible amount of tonnage throughout their territory, and they certainly did. But just after the war, things changed. The war ended in 1945, and that meant the war economy was, well, no longer a thing. Things were starting to stabilize, go back to some normalcy. Not into a Great Depression, of course, but traffic wasn't as high as it once was. Pennsy didn't adapt to this quite as quickly as they should have. In 1946, they lost money for the first time in their entire history, and the situation started to worsen. They took steps to change it. They started purchasing diesels, for example, and that helped, certainly, but they weren't doing as much as they should have been doing. The big problem was the corporate structure, as well as the management style. They were very conservative, not wanting to change very much at any one time. And that was fine, but sometimes you kinda have to take a big risk. diesels were one thing, but they needed to do more. But another problem was the arrogance, the sheer, unbridled, unfiltered pride of the Pennsylvania Railroad. They were out of control in this regard. The suits in charge believed that nothing could possibly stop the mighty Pennsylvania Railroad. They were the best and always would be the best, and they didn't have to do anything to maintain that. Okay? Which, no. Nothing lasts forever. And even when you're on top, you still have to work to maintain that position, you guys. But they really didn't. They'd always maintained a very strict, militaristic style of corporate structure. They had a chain of command, a solid one, and that was never to be questioned. New ideas were often shunned unless they came from the top, and even then they were often resisted. Other companies actually could not stand the managers of the Pennsylvania Railroad because they had such a superiority complex. And they were so big that they often dominated the rate-making policies in the East, which often occurred at the expense of other carriers. In an effort to gain new business, they often set freight rates so low they lost money on movements. Now that type of tactic isn't unheard of, but you can't do that forever because you are quite literally losing money. And the situation only kept getting worse into the 1950s, a time when pretty much every railroad was struggling due to the rise of the trucking industry, as well as affordable and accessible air travel. By the end of the 50s, they were getting even more desperate, so desperate that they began exploring the idea of merging with their own rival, New York Central. Talks of this started in 1957. There were a lot of railroads merging about this time, in an effort to cut costs, where the New York Central really wasn't very keen on that idea. They knew they needed to merge, yes, but they didn't want to merge with Pennsylvania. It wasn't just that they were rivals, they just didn't think it would actually make the situation any better. By that point, Alfred E. Perlman was in charge of New York Central, and Perlman was a legendary railroader, arguably one of the best in American history. He knew better than most that the idea was not really a great one, but he really couldn't do anything to stop it. And he tried. New York Central tried to merge with others, like Chesapeake in Ohio and Baltimore in Ohio, but neither of them were interested, so they had to settle for the Pennsy. The ICC, which probably should have said no to the merger, actually said yes, on the condition they take the struggling New Haven Railroad, which neither the Pennsy nor New York Central wanted, but they said the heck with it, and the Penn Central Transportation Company was born on February 1st, 1968. And that was a disaster. The Pennsylvania Railroad was gone, as was New York Central, now merged into this new beast. And you'd think, running together, being two of the most successful railroads in American history, they might actually do better, as allies. No, frankly, they might as well have set the whole railroad on fire. That's how bad it was. Mass chaos erupted as operations ground to a complete halt. Trains were lost regularly, and New York Central and Pennsy had very, very different management styles. Under Perlman, NYC was very ambitious and welcomed new ideas. Perlman was smart enough to know that times were changing and the railroads would have to adapt. But the Pennsy was, again, very arrogant and clung to the way they had always done business. As a result, neither side could ever agree on what to do. And that's kind of a problem when your railroad is literally on fire. I have a whole video detailing the exact disaster that was Penn Central, but the long and short of it is, they couldn't figure out how to make any of it work, and they weren't willing to work together to fix anything. Nothing got done. Literally. The situation only got worse for both sides, and it killed both companies, unceremoniously. At its worst, they were burning through nearly $1 million a day in losses, which is just horrific. And that's in 1970s money, That's a lot of money to lose in a day. Regularly. All the time. They declared bankruptcy June 21st, 1970. Because of course they did. The problem with this was that they encompassed so much territory that, frankly, their death would result in a significant economic downturn for the entire area. A lot of other railroads depended on them to move their traffic, and a lot of industries depended on them to move their stuff. It's true, trucks and planes had taken over some of the markets that the railroads once had, but not all of it. Trains were still needed, and the government knew it, to the point that they had no choice but to step in and do something. This disaster would lead to two actually good outcomes: Conrail and Amtrak. Amtrak is the nationalized version of passenger service when it comes to railways, and they still operate today. There are some smaller state-run organizations that also offer passenger service, more regional duties, but Amtrak is the federal one. Additionally, the freight end of things was taken over by the Consolidated Rail Corporation, Conrail. Conrail would struggle at first due to, ironically, government regulations, but changes enacted by several different administrations would ease off the rules that railways had to deal with. Conrail would wind up making money in the long run, and eventually be split between Norfolk Southern and CSX, which still operate today. The Pennsy did succeed in going down in history. They were one of the most successful railway companies ever, and much of their rolling stock is sought after in both model train form as well as actual preserved heritage equipment. But they are, in fact, no more, and the truth is that they did it to themselves. They wouldn't change. They stubbornly refused to change. And because of that, they were left exactly where their minds were. In the past. It's a shame, because it didn't have to be that way. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Some Dude 267 Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord R444, A Person 723, Royal Hudson 2860, Icerfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Mr. Sleepy, Travis Stolinsky, Jared Brussel, Joshua Long, Hannah Bird, Amtrak 2024 Productions, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitchen 131-232, Mark Holding, Dr. Racer 78, G Wiz, Mr. Terevel, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.